Hey everybody, welcome back to Change Your Channel. I'm your host, Carol Redden, and I am thrilled today to be talking about mental flexibility. I've got a fantastic co-host with me. Her name is Andrea Scherrer, like the name Scherrer. She's going to be talking about mental flexibility as well as how to be mentally flexible and then some strategies that we can use in our everyday lives. So I will turn it over to Andrea, and I will tell you she has a master's in counseling. She is a counselor at Scottsdale Community College and does fantastic seminars and workshops for our students and community members on atomic habits, the science of happiness, which we'll talk more about on the show. And so I want to turn it over first to Andrea to say thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carol. I'm so happy to be here. This is the first time I have done something in this format, and I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You got it. And I've been to several of your workshops, so I, of course, value all of the content you have to share. I think we could probably have multiple episodes and multiple hours, but I wanted today to focus on mental flexibility. For those who've heard the first episode, and Andrea, I know that you've heard the first episode, actually the very first episode before it was even re-recorded. So you've heard a lot of the traumas and tragedies that I've experienced. And for those who haven't heard it, I'll just say I talk in the first episode a lot about some sexual assaults, things like PTSD, a lot of physical challenges and injuries that I suffered over the years, and a lot about how I think maybe the combination and certainly even the individual instances just kind of pile up. And eventually they got to the place for me, I ended up checking myself into rehab twice to get help with dealing with things. And the second time I was there for a month and learned a lot of great strategies. But one thing I never concretely learned was how to be mentally flexible until I started talking to Andrea and listening to some of the things that she's sharing. So Andrea, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about what mental flexibility means.
Sure. So, there are several topics that Carol and I have had really great conversations about. We like to talk about purpose. We've talked about happiness, and recently, I've gotten really interested in the topic of resiliency. And I think what really interests me about resiliency is that it really is like almost an anchor for things like being happier and it's an anchor for having a sense of purpose. And a big part, kind of a theme that ties together all of those things is this idea of mental flexibility. I think later on you'll probably use this term because I've used it before. I think of it as a superpower that we have. We have this really cool human ability to choose. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it's all about. It's the ability in any situation to consider multiple perspectives. Mm-hmm. And intentionally make a choice to focus on certain aspects, certain outcomes, different parts of the experience, because what we choose to focus on is actually what causes us to have the emotional reaction about the event. Mm-hmm. So it's just that ability to choose to look at multiple perspectives and to choose which one to intentionally focus on.
Which I think is a really great idea. In recording my first episode, I talk about how, for me, as my some of my assaults happened as a very young child. And so I think, and you can speak to this if there's something I'm missing, but as a child, I don't think I would have known that, my strategy was really just to kind of shut down, internalize, accept a lot of shame, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. And I definitely don't want to suggest that even up through, when I had assaults as, in high school and after high school, that anything I did led itself to the sexual assaults. I definitely don't want to suggest that. But is that a skill that you think we develop as we get older? Because I'm thinking back to being a child, I don't think I would have had the ability. I think maybe even still, within the last 2 years, I might not have realized. So is that something you think we develop over time, or is it a matter of once we're aware of it, then we can start doing it?
We absolutely develop it over time. And when we do have a level of awareness about it, I think that's kind of that starting point for making a decision, because it really is, it's a decision. It's about intentionality of what am I going to choose to focus on. And you're right, when you're a little kid, you don't necessarily know that you have this ability. And if you aren't talking to adults or therapists or other people who are helping you see this, you just take it all in, and then that becomes a part of the whole trauma, is the nervous system injury that results from all of those things that happen and stick with us and really kind of are a part of how our brain is wired. But it's definitely, I mean, there is some research that shows that there's a part of resiliency that has a genetic component, and that our experiences, even when we're in utero, can affect our resiliency at birth.
Crazy.
However, it's really, and it almost blows my mind, that part of epigenetic resiliency, I think it's called, is one that I'm wanting to learn more about, because I almost can't wrap my mind around it. But I know it's, an aspect. However, absolutely, mental flexibility can be developed, and it needs to be chosen time and time again. So the awareness is the starting point, but the awareness alone isn't enough. And so that's one thing I'm really blown away how often when I talk about mental flexibility in my classes and my workshops, college students, regardless of age, they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. So it's not just little kids, but if you don't understand neuroplasticity, and that the brain actually, changes with experience, and you don't know that you have this power, it's easy to get lost in those cycles of responding the way that you've already responded. So yes, it absolutely can be developed. Awareness is a good starting point, but it is something that something that you have to continue developing and using and choosing intentionally.
And I appreciate that, because the work that I'm doing, the whole goal of Change Your Channel is to say, you can choose to change your thoughts. So as you said, intentionality, but of course, first, really, you have to be aware of what your thoughts are. And I know for me, as somebody who experienced so many different traumas, again, over the period of, let's say, even the first 20 years of my life, coming from a very volatile, abusive environment to actually then being abused. And I do believe, and I have learned that every one of our traumas does impact sort of our I want to say biochemistry, but certainly we internalize it. Our body internalizes it. And when we don't process it, it's got to go somewhere. And it's probably just going to keep manifesting itself in different ways, within our body. So I'm definitely encouraging people, change your channel to change your thoughts. You mentioned something that I wanted to kind of go back to, which I think I have a decent understanding of, and we don't have to get too sciencey, but just to kind of touch on it. When you say neuroplasticity, what do you mean by that in terms of mental flexibility?
Nutshell, like if you think about a plastic bottle, you think about a plastic bottle, it holds its shape. If it's a soda bottle, it holds its shape, it holds the soda, but it can be changed. It can be crunched up, it can be melted down, it can be changed. And the brain has that same type of plasticity, meaning it has kind of ingrained patterns that have been developed over time. And so they tend to hold their shape. But with effort and sustained, consistent effort, we can also change. So it's really the idea behind, like, if you've heard of growth and fixed mindset, if you've ever heard the term neurons that fire together, wire together, it's both of those things that we used to sort of think that are, maybe once we got to adulthood, the way that we tended to react to things were set in stone. And we now know nothing could be further from the truth. The brain is designed to change with experience.
So if I'm listening or watching, it sounds like the same way that my abuses or traumas impact my brain negatively, give me the opportunity to change it for the better.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes. And that is true, because trauma is the injury, like the experience that you've had cause an injury to your nervous system that then causes your alarm system and your protection system to basically, start doing some things that are helpful if you're trying to survive, but aren't helpful if you're just trying to live a regular life. So it's become wired, and absolutely with practice, with self-regulation, with consistency, you can change those patterns. Like one analogy that I like to think of is, if you've ever lived anywhere where it snows, and if you've had a big snowstorm and you've shoveled one path to your car, you're probably going to take that path over and over again because it's already shoveled. But it doesn't mean you can't shovel another path.
Yeah.
But shoveling that path takes work. You have to remember to do it. It takes effort. But you can shovel another path, and our brains are the same way. If we're on autopilot, we're just going to use that path that's already shoveled.
Yep. Sure, because it's the path of least resistance.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I love that analogy. And something else you made me think of is, I think I got the resource from you, which is the book by Sonia Lubomirsky, The How of Happiness. And she talks about happiness work, which is what we're talking about. And I almost kind of stay away from happiness work because I think people think it's fluffy, like, just have a ray of sunshine and then, you'll be happy. But her research, and you touched on it, and I'll talk more about it in the show, is such that, and again, it's research to say, yeah, some of us are predisposed to things like depression. Some of us have really difficult life experiences. And some of us, we all, though, have the opportunity to do some happiness work, which then impacts those other areas. And so that's kind of why with Change Your Channel, I say, let's start with your thoughts and then let those change your feelings. And again, because not everybody heard the first episode, when I say feelings, I mean what you're experiencing energy-wise, more so than like, I'm just happy or sad or excited. There's this whole vibrational chart that I follow because I have found there to be a lot of value in it. And the very bottom of that vibration is things like shame, guilt, and you kind of move up, and then eventually you get to like happiness, joy, or, joy, enlightenment, that kind of thing. And with practice, as you said, and I think for many, many years, especially as a kid, I lived in that energy space of shame. I referred to as like a really heavy backpack, filled with, like 50 pounds. And then over the course of time, as I don't deal with those traumas and then have new traumas, that backpack gets heavier and heavier. So it almost feels like, I'm not able to make changes. But if I can start by being aware of what I'm working on and change my thoughts, be aware of those feelings, and as you said, which is the last part of Change Your Channel, take some action, then it can create those new patterns, right? And then we can start talking about the difference between like subconscious and conscious parts of our brain and how that impacts the changes we're making or not making. And I think that kind of relates to your example in the snow, right? In terms of subconscious versus conscious mind.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things pop to mind. Like, this is what I love about having conversations with you, is that we just have this, like, that makes me think of that. And then, but yeah, absolutely. The two main things that come to mind is Sonia Lubomirsky's work is great. And you might've talked about this before, or it might come up in a future recording or podcast, but there is a big part of our happiness that's genetic, and we don't want to forget about that, because happiness comes easier to some people than it does to others. And so it's hard to judge other people. And it's also, we have to be careful to judge ourselves. But the second biggest chunk of what affects happiness are our choices and the intentional actions that we engage in, what we think, what we do. And circumstances are the itty bittiest part of the pie. And it's the part that we tend to think is the biggest. We tend to be surprised that genetics is pretty big. And we tend to be really surprised that circumstances are so small. But it's really what we have to focus on are those intentional actions, the happiness work. And it's got to be about person activity fit. And that's another thing that she talks about, which is some of it's going to feel awkward at first because it's new. And some of it's going to feel awkward because it's not your thing. Yeah. But there are, I mean, I think the phrase, the science of happiness, almost becomes a little too overused, but it's really this idea that happiness is understandable, and it is, we can control it. And it's because they've done studies that have said these are the things that increase, the subjective feeling of happiness, that it's controllable. And the one thing that I just want to throw out there, and we can maybe come back to this or not, but it's starting with thoughts is really good. But one thing I've really learned is you can't even get there until you've calmed your nervous system reaction.
Yeah.
So there's self-regulation happens bottom down and top up. And so just really briefly, bottom down means that you need to, or I'm sorry, top up regulation. You have to have a calm body to create a calm mind.
I agree. Obviously.
So things like deep breathing and things like, releasing muscle tension that sometimes we don't think are a big deal. If we can do that before we even start to try to have an impact on our thoughts, our ability to then self-regulate using our thoughts becomes much more possible and possibly even like supercharged. So that's maybe something for a future session or food for thought, is the importance of first calming ourselves before we can even start to work on our thoughts.
And you referred to that as top-down regulation?
Self-regulation.
Okay.
So it's top down or bottom up. So is it body to mind or mind to body?
Well, what I like about that, and I definitely, there's a lot, like you said, I want to talk for hours about all of this, and we will over the course of different episodes, but I can relate to that. And I'm glad you brought me back to that, because, I'm talking now about change your thoughts, change your feelings, change your actions. But I went through a period of, because I mentioned I went to rehab twice. And the second time is when I really started doing research. And the second time was 2014. And when I was in rehab the second time, I learned I was hyper vigilant. I learned I had PTSD. I was dealing with bulimia, which I didn't know what I was doing with food was, could be referred to as bulimia. I was so, in a hypervigilant state, which would be like overly anxious. For anybody who's not familiar with that, there is no way I could go from those places to saying, oh, well, let me just have happy thoughts. Not an option. And I follow one of the resources I've learned, and I would suggest other people check out. Everybody can make their own choices, but I found a lot of value in somebody called Abraham Hicks. I think you know of her as well. She goes by Esther Hicks at Abraham, but she really talks a lot about all of this. And she says, when you're looking at that vibrational scale, if you're trying to go from like shame to happiness, she always says, you can't get there from there. You cannot jump that high on the scale. You've got to kind of work through things first. And I would say for anybody, again, watching or listening, if you're in that really dark space, like I have been, or in the middle of PTSD, or in the middle of, something dark and tragic, I'm definitely not suggesting, it doesn't sound like you are, that happiness is just right around the corner. I don't think we can really start happiness work, like you said, until our nervous system, at the very least, is a little bit calm. And I also talk in my first episode about how all of these are great resources, but I have learned I have to then use them. I have to be an active participant in a way that works for my body and my mind. Meaning I can't just let a doctor say to me, hey, like you said, something that maybe feels uncomfortable. You need to start running or doing, some kind of exercise. If I have chronic pain and I'm not able to even walk, it's better for me to do something that my body will respond to than what some external source is telling me to do. That makes sense. There's so much about what you said that I would love to talk more about.
Yeah, but it's just a good, it's just a good reminder that, we do want to focus on our thoughts and then how those impact our actions. But even before we get there, it's not overlooking the importance of breath, doing the body scan, releasing that tension, even strangely, peripheral vision. So one of the pieces of hypervigilance, and I mean, what hypervigilance is it's like our brain is constantly scanning the environment for danger based on past experiences. And so one of the things that we do is we tunnel vision. Mm-hmm. So one thing you can just do is just like relax your vision and look around the room and like pay attention to what's in your peripheral vision. And that actually triggers a series of biochemical responses in your body that then allow you, it basically, and again, this goes beyond probably where we're going today, but, different parts of our brain are responsible for different things. And when we feel like there's any sort of a threat or a danger, even if it's real, imagined, perceived based on past learning, a different part of our brain is functioning. And so something as simple as taking a deep breath, releasing the tension in your body, having a wider field of vision can then get you to the place where you can be like, okay, now what am I thinking? How can I be mentally flexible and change those thoughts, so that my actions are better? So it's really amazing how everything is so connected and so important, but each individual piece is not necessarily uber complicated.
No, breathing and being mindful on breathing isn't hard, but I will say I've been in spaces, and I think I shared this with you or on my, test recording, that there were days when it was really difficult for me to just exist, open my eyes. I thought, oh, this feels like a lot of work, smiling. So I can get it. If somebody's watching or listening and says, listen, I can't even be aware of my breathing, I get it. And so to those folks, I would say, if that's your first step, is just being mindful about breathing, that's a win. That's a huge win. And it reminds me of one of the things when I was in Sierra Tucson, I went in to see, I forget what this particular therapist was working with me on. He had like this plastic sphere that would collapse and expand. And he would give it to patients to help them focus on like their attention, or focus their attention on the, being mindful. He started doing that, and I was so hyper vigilant. I said, you have to stop that. That's making me crazy, because it was so slow. I could not. It just made things so much worse for me. He's like, oh, okay, I'll just put this right away. And I said, yes, please, because I'm not there yet. So for anybody listening and watching, I think breath is probably a great, if like that's your first thing. Do you think, I mean, I can't think of anything before that. Right. And breathing will calm, even temporarily, even if it's just temporarily, the nervous system, to just kind of say, okay. And then there are things beyond that, right? And they tell us this in rehab too. Think about the air conditioning, be mindful of, what you're seeing over here and the concreteness of some of what's in our reality. Does that make sense? That kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Breath is like, I've been researching on breath. And just a quick note for anybody, a side note, I'll get to this in another episode, but one of the traumas and tragedies I experienced was being exposed to mold for several months. And it impacted, as you say, my brain, which then impacted my nervous system considerably. And I wasn't able to breathe very well. And it's still kind of restricted. But since then, I've learned strategies. I was eventually sent to a physical therapist, who then sent me to a vocal coach, a speech pathologist. And she taught me some breathing exercises. Again, as you say, not difficult, but they completely changed, just opening things up to the extent that I could breathe better. And when we can breathe better, it's not shallow, it's actually intentional. I almost considered it life-changing. So I'm glad you brought us back to that.
Yeah. And it's a way to come back to the present moment too, and that's, that intentionally coming back to the present moment and focusing on that breath. And, it's a starting point, but also it's an advanced practice as well, because to truly use it, I mean, the idea is that during any experience that's causing you anxiety or making you feel less happy, it's to always remind yourself every few minutes, scan your body for tension, release it, take a few deep breaths. And I mean, that could mean in a particularly stressful time of your life, doing that a couple hundred times a day, which sounds crazy, but it only takes a second to do. And again, because you're trying to rewire your brain for new neurons to fire together, it does require that level. So it's a great starting point, but then also once somebody is a little bit more advanced, it also becomes a practice and discipline, remembering to do it. And that's, because that's where the real change comes from.
And I agree. I think it's not funny, but I have found that we will put work in one way or another. Either that work will be reactive and we will be taking medicines and seeing doctors and therapies and certainly suffering, or we can spend the time at some point trying to be more proactive by doing things like focusing on our breathing multiple times a day. One of the things I'm working on is making some bracelets getting some bracelets made that are made out of different healing materials and they're beads that will say things like breathe and that kind of thing, because it will be then visible and hopefully reminds us that like some of us do need reminders.
Mhm.
You know, I can think back to many times in my life where I'm so anxious that I have very shallow breathing, which then perpetuates some of the problems. So I appreciate that. That is a good reminder. I also want to talk about, you mentioned there's some other concrete things we can do. And again, this won't be for everybody right away, but for people maybe like me who have thought about breathing, and I've done some research on sleep and, you know, some of those other, you know, physical therapy, but things I can do to take care of myself. You mentioned that there's some concrete things, if you could talk about those.
Absolutely. You know, I think there's several things, and I'm just picking two that I think are ones that can be applicable and relevant for a lot of people, and they're doable, and they have a lot of bang for the buck in that if they are things that are practiced on a regular basis, they can make a big difference. Really being aware of the power of what you think, the power of beliefs. And so that's the first thing I'll talk about is something called the ABC model. And then the second thing I'll talk about is, you know, cultivating optimism as an explanatory style. So how you can actually choose to be mentally flexible in how you explain events to yourself in a way that leads to a better outcome. So those, if it works out time-wise, those will be the two kind of concrete things that I'll talk about. The ABC model is an idea that goes back to rational emotive therapy. So its roots are in therapy, but it's applicable to anybody. And it's, you know, it's got the little moniker that makes it kind of easy to remember. It's the idea that we tend to think events happen and those events make us feel a certain way or do a certain thing.
Which, if I can interrupt, is
absolutely
kind of like what Sonia's saying, right? That piece of the pie that people think is the biggest piece, but actually is small. Is that the same piece?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Because the circumstances, the life events are these things that happen to us. And then there's this big chunk of like how we intentionally choose to think about it. And so if you're thinking about kind of the ABCs, you know, A is the activating event, which is a little bit awkward, but it just makes it start with an A. So it's any life event. You know, if you think about it, like, I mean, especially think about the things you've shared, you know, those life events weren't in your control. Many things that happen to us are not in our control. They're not our fault. We, you know, maybe we play a role in some of them, but life events many times are outside of our realm of control. So if we believe that events cause consequences, well, then that leads us to believe that our consequences are also outside of our control.
Yeah.
This happens to me, I get mad. This happens to me, I get depressed. This happens to me, I'm a failure, you know. But we really, what we fail to do is think about the power of the missing letter, the B, which are our beliefs.
Okay.
So A is the activating event. That actually triggers, it doesn't trigger a consequence. It triggers us to think something.
Okay.
And then what we think is actually what causes the C, the consequence.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's like the basic framework. And so it feels very quick. We go from A to C, we go from event to consequence very fast.
Mm-hmm.
And many people spend their whole life never slowing down enough to think about the B.
Yeah.
When you don't think about the B, you tend to react.
Okay.
When you do think about the B, you tend to respond.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between reacting and responding?
Yeah. Reaction feels very automatic. It's very based in emotion. It feels outside of our control. It feels like something we snap to.
Okay.
And a response is an intentional way of responding to the event that comes from a little bit more logic. You know, not that there's not emotion there. It's not about ruling out emotion, but it's about introducing logic, belief, how we think, again, being mentally flexible. What am I choosing to focus on? So our response is a reaction that has some logic involved. We've thought it through. It's typically more proactive. It's typically healthier. It's typically something that helps the situation rather than makes the situation worse.
Okay. And you know, it's funny. Well, not funny, but I remember learning something in rehab about the wise mind. And one of the things that I share, because, I teach communication classes, so I definitely stay away from, most of the sciencey brain stuff, because that's not in my wheelhouse. But just having experienced this and then also worked through it on my own, we talk a little bit about the emotional part of our brain versus the logic part of our brain. And then in the middle, if we can apply the both of them based on the situation, we can get to this place called the wise mind, which says, I think what you're saying too is that, like, just 100% reaction or emotion is usually not helpful in a tense situation, whether it's just with ourselves or with other people. And sometimes only logic keeps us detached from emotion. So that can also be tricky. So I'm just trying to think, and I know this, gets a little bit maybe off topic, but is there a way to go from instead of reacting to responding, or including more logic? And I guess maybe that takes us to like CBT or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all related. Like, the full model actually goes A, B, C, D, E, F, because it actually kind of walks you through how to do that. So it's, but it's really practically applicable to life too. The first step is to know that this happens. The first step is to completely recognize the power of our beliefs, because events in life are not in our control always. But really what happens in our head is in our control. Now, the caveat is there are some automatic beliefs that are based on a script that comes from past events, but we still have the ability to recognize those and to work on changing them. So I don't want to oversimplify it and just say, all you got to do is think positively, because that can be toxic to think that way. Sure. But we have much more control over what goes on inside our brain than we do the life events that happen to us. So sure. It's recognizing the model, but then it's also really taking some time to think about, what are my automatic Bs? What are the filters that I kind of apply based on my experiences? What are the irrational beliefs that I might have? Am I believing everything I think? That's one thing that's interesting to think about. Like, thoughts can pop to mind, but even though it's your own thought, you can still stop and say, wait a minute. That wasn't very nice. That's not me talking to myself kindly. I actually don't believe that. I might have thought it, but I don't believe it. Here's what I do believe. So it's recognizing the beliefs that come to mind. And we a lot of times hear them as self-talk. Yeah. Right. That's how, if you're trying to think about, how do I recognize my beliefs? It's, what do I say to myself? Sometimes that voice is your own. Sometimes it's somebody from your past. Sometimes it's an image, but really trying to recognize what pops to mind, and then changing it. So if you kind of expand out the model, ABC, and then the D is dispute. Okay, here's the belief I had. I always mess everything up. Do I always mess everything up? No, I don't. Maybe I've had this one pattern for a long time, but hey, I can dispute this. I can think of a lot of things that tell me that, that I have not always messed things up. So actually actively disputing it, which then the E is thinking about the emotion. So asking yourself, okay, if I think this, if I focus on this, how do I feel? And is there something else? Can I be mentally flexible? Can I choose to focus on another thought that makes me feel better? Emotion, that can, then lead into feeling and acting in a different way.
Okay. Yeah, I've been working on some of this, I think, recently. I have noticed, and like you said, it comes from awareness. And I mentioned, growing up in for me at least, in an abusive environment. Also, I moved around a lot, lived with different family members for periods of time, went to different schools, a lot of instability, and always just felt invisible, always felt, I didn't have any value unless I was outside of school and excelling. I had zero sense of my value, which then obviously, for most of us, we carry into adulthood. So I have noticed, just in doing this work, there are times when, let's say I don't know, in a customer service situation, and somebody doesn't handle it the right way. They say, here's what we can't do. And they lead with something like that. My belief automatically goes to, well, it's because I'm not good enough. It's because I'm not worth your time. right? And then my gut reaction, or it's a reaction, right? Because it's certainly, there's no logic, it's just emotion, is to say, well, no, you do need to take care of me. And then it doesn't come out in the best way because there's no logic involved. So I've really started to try to be mindful about that. And just as you said, pay attention to, even if the customer service person is not doing a good job, or doctor. In some cases, I've had this happen with doctors. For example, I had a pain management doctor while I was in rehab basically tell me I wasn't experiencing pain. It was all in my brain. And I did not respond well to that, as you can imagine, because I had at the time very bad pain in a lot of places. So if I can just kind of tap into the fact that, okay, first, I can be aware of what I'm doing, but secondly, I don't have to internalize what he's giving me. That's a complete choice, which is, he's not doing a good job as being a doctor, in my opinion, but I don't have to accept that. And it doesn't have anything to do with me. Right? He's got his own stuff happening. Maybe, he just because he's a doctor doesn't mean he doesn't need to go through this himself. So I found that to be a little bit freeing, which is to say, and we talked, I know, about the 4 agreements with Don Miguel Ruiz. I can pay attention to my word and my actions, but I really don't have to put a lot of stock into what other people are doing and saying, if it doesn't serve me.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, 2 things that come to mind there when you're talking about that. It's again why I think of this as a superpower. Like, we have the ability to rescue ourselves. We're our own superhero. We have this superpower. Because in that moment when we have that reaction, it can either lead us to continue to engage in behaviors that haven't helped us, emotions that don't feel good to us, or we can recognize, okay, that's a trigger for me. Okay, that's a trigger. Now I need to breathe. Okay, scan my body, release that tension. Do all those things so that your calm body can help create a calm mind. And then you can think through things in a way that's more logical, that helps you, again, like exactly like you said, this is more about him than me. But it's also, fault and responsibility, right? Like, things that happen to us in our past are not our fault, but we still do have a responsibility for how we choose to react or respond to things that happen in our current life. And so again, it's taking that pause, taking that moment, and remembering, I actually have control here. But that moment when we get triggered, it feels so unpleasant. But if all we do is react to that unpleasantness, we're kind of further victimizing ourselves, rather than we can take that as a moment to go, hey, here's myself telling myself, this is a trigger for you. Most likely in the moment, I'm safe, things are fine, this person isn't out to get me, but I need to do something. I need to take a break, I need to reframe, or I might react in a way that isn't going to be good for me.
And it won't, the 2 things that makes me think of is Abraham Hicks talks about something called, I think it's segment intention, which is, if I identify, let's say, doctors as a trigger, because I've been to many over the years and have learned that I don't get a lot of value from traditional medicine. And I don't, that's part of why I don't take any medicines anymore, because I have not found a lot of value. But if I know that I'm going to walk into a situation that is a trigger for me, that would be sort of a segment. And so I can do some positive self-talk in my car on the way, which is to say exactly what you did. I am seeking help. I'm going to listen to what this person has to say. And I have control about coming to this meeting. I have control over the feedback, what I'm going to, in terms of what I'm going to do with it. And I'm going to use this information to better my life, as opposed to reactively thinking on my way in, well, I'm going to pay $30 for some probably man to tell me some things, a bunch of pills to take or something that's not going to help me. Because if I go in with that energy and that mindset, that's probably what I'm going to walk out with, is negativity as well.
Yep.
Because energy wise, I brought it in with me.
Well, you brought it in with you, and a term that, may or may not be familiar to people who are listening, but there's this idea too. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we go into something with our defenses up, it changes how we interact with people.
Sure.
And then what we do, they're like, oh, she doesn't, she doesn't respect my authority. And then they react to that energy, to those behaviors too. And then it becomes the cycle. And the only person with control to, or with the ability to break your cycle is you. I'm the only person who can break my cycle. It's like, not to say that nobody else has any fault, not to say anybody else wasn't partially responsible, but that really is neither here nor there, because the only thing I can do is choose to break the cycle. So yeah, so kind of learning to befriend your triggers. Like, they're actually, like, what's really interesting is everything that happens to us that sometimes feels bad temporarily, it's our brain and our body trying to help us survive.
Mm-hmm.
And befriending ourselves, like, that being compassionate to ourselves, being like, thank you, trigger. I know that doesn't feel good, but thank you. Thank you for reminding me that this is something where I need to do a little work. I need to be really aware of my thoughts and my beliefs, and I need to try to reframe them. I need to be extra kind to myself. I need to remember to breathe. It's thanking our brains and our bodies for that, rather than feeling like we're flawed, that it's only something negative or wrong with us, or something, designed to hurt us. It's there to help.
And when we think of it in terms of gratitude, being thankful for the opportunity to learn the lesson, we then empower ourselves, as opposed to, again, feeling like a victim. It's funny you mentioned self-fulfilling prophecy, because I just talked about this in my class. I was, creating recordings, and we were talking about perception and of self and others. So shout out to my students that, hey, this is, real life application of it. We didn't plan that. So hopefully they're listening. But I also wanted to just suggest something else that I've learned. It's not maybe necessarily sciencey, but something I believe to be true. And that is, we continue to get presented with the same situation until we learn the lesson from it. And so for me, I keep getting myself maybe in some of these tricky situations, let's say with doctors, because I haven't learned the lesson. And maybe the lesson is to just be more removed, just be more objective. And as you said, I don't think the takeaway here is letting everybody off the hook for bad behavior. The takeaway is choosing to see it in a way that's not harmful. We don't have to accept the negativity that comes our way, and we don't have to add negativity to the situation, right? We can determine, to the best of our ability, at least how we feel and what we think, as opposed to, I'm sure I did this a lot. I'm trying to think, because I was so reactive for so many years. And I think probably a lot of people can relate to that. It doesn't even come to my mind that I can change my channel and create a different reality. It would not have been on my radar. So I can relate to that for anybody who's listening that says, what? So today we're really just kind of planting seeds. And for those who are listening or watching, I'd love to know what you guys think about these topics. And if you want us to go more in depth, because it's an ongoing. And for some of us like me, it's going to take work. I was just talking to Aaron Torres about this in a separate, my first recording. He shared also it's something that he works on. And for us, we'll have to work on it probably. I know I will, at least the rest of my life. But my hope and my instinct is that, like you said, yes, I might have to shovel more than one path in the snow, but once I've shoveled them, they're there for me. I don't always have to re-shovel. I mean, it's going to snow and maybe I have to re-shovel the same path, but it doesn't snow that many times for me to have to re-shovel the same path, right? And hopefully I can get better and better at going, oh, I'm faster at this because there's already this thing here that I started. I can just go back to it and kind of jam through next time. So I think that's a great analogy. And I know that you also wanted to talk about another opportunity, which is, again, instead of seeing shoveling the snow as a chore, I can see it as an opportunity.
Exactly. So that's just the other thing I wanted kind of as a takeaway, like something that you can put into practice right away. And the one thing I will, and, and Carol, you've said this, but it's really important. Some of these ideas, they just feel so good and it's fun to learn them. And so you're like, yeah, and then you don't use them. And that's, like we can't emphasize that enough. It's pick something small, but put it into practice on a regular basis. But a lot of times we think about optimism and pessimism. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of oversimplification of these terms. There is a lot of research that says people who have an optimistic kind of point of view, outlook on life tend to be healthier, happier, all the things that most people say that they want. I want to be more resilient. I want to be more successful. I want to be happier. I want to feel more in control. I want to feel more hopeful. All of that is tied to optimism. But there's sometimes this misconception that it's just putting on rose-colored glasses and just being like, just kind of like we were talking about at the beginning of our segment, oversimplifying it, making it too easy. Well, just look at things, look at the bright side, silver lining, everything. And there's a lot more to it, but there's one specific way that you can look at it as an explanatory style. So when things happen to us in our life, those A's, those activating events, and this is all related. It's a process of thinking through the B's, but we explain things to ourselves. This thing happened because, and we have to stop and think about how we're explaining it to ourselves. So we can use a model of thinking through internal versus external.
Okay.
Do I internalize what happened? Is it all about, is it about me? Am I involved in it? Or am I completely externalizing the event, which is this was completely somebody else or completely the situation? There are times when one of those leads to a better outcome for us. And that's why it's not black and white. It's not a perfect process, but it's about being mentally flexible. Am I taking some personal responsibility while also recognizing that I don't control everything?
Yeah.
So it's being mentally flexible when you think about that. It's also thinking about, is this universal? Am I explaining this to me as something that's universal or specific? Meaning, am I saying to myself, this is something that happens all the time in all situations? Or am I saying to myself, this happened right now with this person in this situation? So is it universal? Is it specific? And then is this temporary or is it permanent? So is this something that's going on for me right in this moment? Or am I telling myself, I'm never going to feel better. I'm never going to get better. I'm never going to succeed. I'm never going to get past this. So we do this. We all do this. And it's another thing that we can kind of stop and think about, like, okay, how do I explain things to myself? And we sometimes have one explanatory style for good events and a different explanatory style for bad events. But we can, and again, like you said, when you're first shoveling the snow, it feels awkward, it takes time, but you can actually write these things down. How am I explaining this to myself? Okay, could I be mentally flexible and think about the fact that this is really just happening right now in this one specific event? It's not affecting other parts of my life. It's not going to go on forever. Can I be mentally flexible, take some personal responsibility while not shouldering all of it?
Yeah.
The outcome being more hope and a greater sense of control. When somebody applies optimistic thinking, which tends to be a little bit more external. And optimistic thinking tends to be more specific and temporary, right? It's just happening right now in this one part of my life. Other things are good, and in doing that, we tend to feel more hopeful for the future because we feel like, okay, there are some things in my control. So it's another way of being mentally flexible, focusing on our B's, and again, thinking and explaining things to ourselves in a way that the consequence feels better to us.
Yeah. It sounds like there's so much to it. And like you said, these are great tools. And I know that it's always like, in theory, this sounds wonderful. It's kind of like, getting the gym membership or thinking about starting a diet. Those sound like great ideas, but then you actually need to apply them. And again, that can be a struggle. I mentioned in my first episode, for many years, because I had been through so many traumas, one of my beliefs is that I am a victim. And I just kind of carried that around with me. And so if I believe I'm a victim, then I will either see bad things that happen to me because of me, I'm internally, not worth it or whatever, or beyond my control. And so again, I'm still spending mental energy perpetuating that belief. I'm still spending it. I think what we're talking about here is spending the same energy, but making it in a more positive way. So it might initially feel like more work, but it's really just changing our channel. You see what I did there? The television or the radio was on and the events are happening and we're still going through life. It's just, are we tuning into the negativity or are we trying to tune into the positivity? Either way, we're going to spend the effort. One is more comfortable than the other. For me, I'm sure I internalized a lot. If my beliefs about myself were negative, I am sure I thought of a lot of things as universal. I always date people like this. They always see me like that, or what have you. And then I'm sure I thought about them as permanent. I've definitely been in those places, and each one of those categories is on the pessimistic side. So it's just about little by little, making those changes. And I guess I want to put you on the spot as kind of a final question. And so if you don't have an answer in your mind right now, that's okay. And then I'll see if you want to have a final thought before we close. But if there were people listening today and they said, all of this sounds great, I want to hear more, I want to research more, but there was one thing we could do today, like the simplest place to start, what would you say, either something we talked about or haven't talked about in terms of changing their channel?
I would say, because I was actually kind of thinking about this when you were talking, because I do feel like, especially with the optimism and pessimism stuff, because there's 3 factors and they each have an A and a B, it just starts to feel a little too much. I think the best first place to start is just to become aware of your beliefs, your self-talk, and to actually start paying attention in both good situations, bad situations, stressful situations, and start writing it down. When you have a strong emotion, whether it's an emotion you want to feel or you don't want to feel, but probably especially when it's one you don't want to feel, when you have that be kind of like that reminder to you. Okay, what just happened? What was the event? Write down the event. Okay, what went through my mind? What did I say to myself? So becoming aware and actually kind of writing it out. And even just stopping there. Don't try to do awareness and action at the same time. That will probably just end up leading to you not doing anything in the long run. So take a week and build your awareness of your beliefs, your thoughts, the way you're explaining things to yourself, your self-talk, pay attention. Okay. And then kind of come back to this model and think about, okay, what are the consequences when I think this way? What are the emotions I feel? And then, okay, then start kind of the disputing, can I change my beliefs? Can I choose to focus on something else? Can I remind myself, this is just happening right now. This is temporary. It's not permanent. Am I, generalizing this to all parts of my life, or am I remembering it was this one event with this one person, so it's that where to start, I think, would be with really paying attention to the things that we sometimes don't even recognize or think about, and then writing them down. Don't just think about them, because then they go away like a dream, but start writing them down and tracking them and pay attention, so that you can be a little bit more of like a social scientist for yourself. When you look at it on paper, when you take it out of your head and put it on paper, it just becomes something you can analyze a little bit more critically.
Yeah. And I like that, because for me, journaling, a lot of people will talk about journaling. I have not found value in journaling. For me, the way I understood journaling, it was just something I did, and it took time. And I didn't find value. So I always stopped journaling. But this feels very intentional, which is, like you said, and I don't think it has to be really long. Just, here was the event. Here's what I thought. And here's what I felt. Right. And if we can just start with those, like you said, then we can look back at them and really look for patterns. Or what are my triggers? What's my go-to response or my go-to feeling? And if we can track them, ideally multiple times a day, like those, especially if they're negative, I think we can then look at, wow, I feel sad a lot, or I feel like I don't have value a lot. That's probably something that's playing in my brain without realizing it. So I really like that, just awareness, and maybe writing some things down. It's a great step.
And either use as a trigger a strong emotion, or if, again, the day gets busy and things get crazy, you could also just set a time, set an alarm in your phone for every couple of hours, just to kind of stop and think back, in the moment, what am I feeling? Did I have any strong emotional reactions? How are things going? But using like those phone reminders can be really valuable when you're trying to pay attention to something that's just really easy to just be experiencing on autopilot. It's all about, and I think probably the common theme to everybody you're going to talk with and the things you're sharing is like getting off of autopilot and being intentional, making that choice to be in the present moment and to be where you are, because it's a brain efficiency thing. We're so busy. Our brain is going to default to autopilot as long as we let it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where a lot of the negative feelings reside. And so it's making that choice to be intentional, paying attention, and then disputing and thinking about, okay, what would be a thought or a belief or a way of talking to myself that would have a different consequence, a more positive consequence for me. And I've created, worksheets on both of these concepts. I don't know if you have a way to share those with people, if I share those with you, if that's something you can do, but just kind of a way to kind of remember the concepts, and then also just kind of give you like a working framework for keeping track of things.
Yeah, for anybody watching and listening, I'll put those in sort of the comments page, depending on the platform you're engaging with us on. I'd love to give people tools. That's the whole point, is for me to share, again, what I've learn from people like you, and then tips that I'm using. When we talk about reminders in the phone, I have some of those throughout the week, different times that change my channel. So before it's kind of like segment and intention, whether I fall into negativity throughout the day or not, those little reminders help change my channel to put me in a higher vibration, a little more positive. So if I'm already a little bit higher and something happens, I'm not going to drop down as far because I've been proactive, right? So I appreciate that. I'd love to have worksheets. And I want to ask before I close, if you have any final thoughts, questions or comments that you'd want to share with the folks listening or watching.
I think just thank you for those of you who are listening. I think, one of the most important first steps for anything is having an interest and just really being committed to your personal growth, to learning something new and to practice it. I guess my final thought would be to really kind of create this image in your head of you in your cape, whatever your cape looks like, remembering that these are your superpowers, that, I think if the last year has taught us anything, it has to be that we don't know what's coming around the corner, in our personal lives or, societally, things are going to happen. And, we tend to think that things happen, it causes us stress, and we can sometimes start to feel like we're a victim of our environment, but if you take these steps to really think about this superpower that you have, it just it empowers you to know that regardless of what's happening to you, you can choose to be happier, and it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is something that I think is really empowering, especially when it feels like there's a lot of things in the world that are uncertain, that are scary, that are outside of our control. To really focus in on those things that you can control, and to remember that you have that power within you.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's something to be said. And one of my takeaways is, how do I contribute to my healing? So thanks, Andrea, for talking about mental flexibility today. I do appreciate that you've called it a superpower. I do believe also that it's a superpower because it is within us and it's within our ability, even if it's those little things, little by little, that still takes incredible amount of attention and courage. So I appreciate that. For those who want to learn more or stick with us to get more content, you can find us online at www.changeyourchannel.life. We're also on Facebook. I will put those links in the chat. If you sign up for the newsletter, I'll be sending that on a weekly-ish basis. So hopefully you guys will continue to check that out. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.